in the corner of the bar. The school bully wrapped around my waist. I was too scared to move. He was so close to me, and the smell of alcohol enveloped me. Suddenly, the school bully took my hand, and raised his hand to let my index finger lightly touch the pink band-aid on his brow. Is it pretty? You gave me a band-aid. I sent it. Obviously he happened to meet me coming out of the pharmacy that day, raised an eyebrow at me, and snatched the band-aid I just bought from the bag. But he's a well-known bully in our university, and he doesn't blink when he hears about a fight, so of course I don't dare to put a fart. He stammered, good looking. I think it's unusually good looking. The corners of Edward Lee's mouth curled slightly, and he looked lazy and sloppy. You're afraid of me. I lowered my head and didn't speak. Edward Lee rubbed his cheeks and chuckled, his voice low and slow. Sheila Lamb, the grace of dripping water should be reciprocated by a spring. How do you say to repay the grace of saving lives? Who will tell me when he saved my life? I became neighbors with the school bully. The doors opened at 7 a.m. and the opposite door also happened to open. So, I looked at the person who lived across from me, and he was a very handsome boy. When he woke up, his hair was still a little messy, which made his cold and hard eyebrows and eyes soft. It's a simple white short-sleeved shirt, but it looks good on him. The slender and bony hands held the doorknob, and he casually looked up at me, his gaze faint. I figured if he hadn't been the famous school bully at our school, Edward Lee, I would have been tempted to look at him a few more times. But he's Edward Lee, and even a man like me who does my duty has heard a lot about him. The eldest son of the Lee family, who relied on his family strength to act mischievously at school, should never provoke anyone in a big way. I pretended to look away inadvertently, panicking in my heart. I was just an ordinary female college student, and I must not be involved in anything with this Edward Lee. Who knows? Edward Lee lazily raised his eyes. We met yesterday. Of course I know we've seen it, but they were on the 13th floor yesterday. I'm too quiet and timid, so I've never been social. Instead of having my roommate talk so quietly every day that he couldn't be so quiet for fear of scaring me, I moved out on my own. They were so nice to me, so I didn't want them to control the time because I turned off the lights early every night, and even had to call my boyfriend. In that case, I would be too ignorant. So, I rented a bachelor apartment on my own. Yesterday was the first day I moved to the dormitory, and when I dragged my suitcase away, my roommate was worried and said that I was deceived outside alone, and I definitely couldn't take care of myself. I've been honest since I was a child, and I'm weak and small, so the people around me will take care of me spontaneously. So, I'm glad I can be so honest. But my roommate also said that scammers like to cheat people like me the most. People are stupid and have a lot of money. I smiled and said to them, don't worry, I've always been lucky. At most I've had a little bit of bad luck. I've never had a big bad luck. Don't worry, I can take care of myself. However, on the night I moved into the dormitory, I encountered an unexpected situation. It was late at night, around 11 p.m., and I had a regular schedule, and I usually went to bed at 10 o'clock. On that day, I was woken up in pain, and my menstrual period came early, but I had just moved to the apartment, and I hadn't had time to prepare these things, so I hesitated for a long time, and finally added a long sleeve on a hot day, put on a mask, and wrapped myself tightly, and went out. I am not only timid but also socially afraid, and I feel very insecure when I go to an unfamiliar place by myself. But I managed to buy sanitary napkins and was so happy when I walked back with the bag. It's just that the smile froze at the moment the elevator door opened. There were 4 joking boys standing inside, and they didn't look like good people in their clothes. They came up from the basement floor, and I only knew the black-haired boy among them. A famous school bully, Edward Lee, often appears in the school post bar. I was stunned at the elevator door for a while, and a red-haired boy inside impatiently urged me, sister, hurry up if you want to come in. When I reacted, I was already in. Help! I was crying stupidly. I could have waited for the next shift. The elevator was full of their alcohol, very strong. I carefully raised my eyes, and found that they had small wounds on their faces, large and small, and Edward Lee also had a hole on his brow. I immediately picked up my phone, and sent a message to the dormitory group, Edward Lee and I were in an elevator. Roommate 1. Roommate 2. So, Sheila Lamb. Why are you still out there so late? Sheila Lamb. Me. I had an accident and came out to buy sanitary napkins. Roommate 3. Edward Lee. Is the real person handsome? Roommate 4. Is it time to ask if handsome is handsome? That's Edward Lee. Sheila Lamb. You can press down a floor. Don't mess with them. Me. Okay. The first time I did this kind of thing, I was a little nervous, and my hands were shaking while carrying the bag of sanitary napkins, and the ark was quite large. At that moment, my head was full of rumors about how fierce Edward Lee was, and he was wearing long sleeves. It was too hot. I raised my hand to wipe a handful of sweat, and my fingers hesitated which floor to press at the elevator buttons. Suddenly, a bony hand reached behind me and pressed a 9 key, canceling the 13 that the elevator had already pressed. The next second, the elevator doors opened, and Edward Lee raised his feet and walked out. The red-haired man with him asked him suspiciously, Edward Lee, it's not there yet. Edward Lee turned around, put his hands in his pockets, gave me a nonchalant look, and said to the red hair, let's go. What so much? I suddenly want to take a walk. Edward Lee said so, and the red-haired ones immediately followed out. I waited for them to leave before I breathed a sigh of relief and pressed my floor 15. It took a long time for my rapid heartbeat to settle down, but who can tell me why? Will I be able to open the door face to face with Edward Lee the next morning? I wanted to pretend I didn't see it and walked away, but he said, we met yesterday. Freeze me where I was. He probably hadn't woken up yet, and his voice was a little tired, but I was so scared that I trembled. I was covered so tightly yesterday that he could still recognize me. I turned nervously. Okay, it seems to be. Edward Lee slouched against the door. I was so nervous that I accosted Edward Lee, and I almost didn't hesitate, and immediately shook my head. No. Edward Lee leaned against the door and chuckled. Law. Why are you so afraid of me if it's not Big A? I don't know how I finally agreed to cook noodles for Edward Lee. In his words, we are alumni, so it's not too much to do us a favor and cook a bowl of noodles. I looked at him with a frown. It's a bit excessive. I have morning classes. Don't worry, you won't eat in vain. He relied on his height and pinched my neck to carry me forward, and my eyes widened and I jumped at least 2 meters away. Edward Lee looked at me half squinting. What's wrong again? I said to him seriously. You can't touch me. Edward Lee raised an eyebrow, dislike Lao Tzu. I shook my head and explained. No, it's my own dislike of being in contact with strangers. Edward Lee, you have to be careful not to touch me. Perhaps my tone of voice was too serious, and Edward Lee looked at me, with ridicule in his eyes, and he sneered. Okay, it's small, and there are a lot of problems. Immediately, he gently grabbed the corner of my dress with 2 fingers and led me forward. That's all right. I felt it, and as if I could accept it, I didn't refuse. I was forced to cook noodles for him in the kitchen, and God knows how fantastical it was. I was cooking noodles for Edward Lee, and no one believed me. I was about to finish explaining my ancestors to Edward Lee for the last 2 generations. His eyes were so oppressive. I was such an exclusive person. He would say anything when he asked me. It's hard for me to get acquainted with someone, but it's amazing that Edward Lee makes it easy for me to relax like I've never done before. I was cooking noodles in the kitchen, and he was sitting at the dining table, staring at me with his chin propped up. You're so timid. His voice was lazy and a little rustle. I'm still timid, and I've got the guts to let him into the house. But he was Edward Lee, and I could only whisper, I'm not cowardly. Edward Lee's eyes are light brown when you look closely, and she always gives people a flirtatious feeling when looking at people, not small. So what were your hands shaking last night? I'm going to eat people. I put my face in the face of the hand. She. You don't look like good people. He listened to my muttering and chuckled. Sheila Lamb. Right. Where do we make you think we're not good people? I thought about it for a moment. You all have colorful hair. For some reason, Edward Lee couldn't seem to control the upturned corners of his mouth. He propped his chin and said with a distinct smile in his tone, well, you're right. It's really not a good thing. I'll tell them to change it. I was surprised. So he was approving with me. After the noodles were cooked, I hesitated for a long time and didn't dare to go out. I didn't know how to go and tell him that he had to go to his house to get the bowl himself. It's so troublesome for him. I'm so afraid that he will hit me. What's wrong again? Edward Lee suddenly spoke up, startling me on the spot. I turned to look at him, with a look of horror in his eyes. He raised an eyebrow. Scared again? Nope. I have a hard mouth, but I like to pick my hands when I'm nervous. Edward Lee saw that I was about to break my hand, and reached out and hit the back of my hand. I frowned at him. Can't touch mine. Okay, then you can cut your hands yourself, and I don't bother to care about you. I bowed my head and said nothing. Edward Lee looked at me like this. Maybe he was also upset, and rubbed his hair a little irritably. Lao Tzu won't eat you again. Just say anything. But I might have to trouble you to go to your house, and get your bowl to eat. Edward Lee half narrowed. Give me a reason. I stubbornly said. You can't use my bowl. Edward Lee sighed lightly and lowered his head to me. What do you mean? I'm afraid that Lao Tzu is sick. I swallowed my saliva and hurriedly waved my hand. No, it's not that you're sick. It's me who is sick. I had a disease, a very strange disease, which I had since I was a child. When I was a child, because of my weirdness, the children would call me Little Monster. When I grew up and learned to hide, people would only think that I was a socially phobic and quiet person. My mom and dad always told me that I was no different from ordinary people, that I was normal. But I know that I'm different from everyone else, because normal people will not be afraid of crowded places. They will not be so resistant to the touch of others. They will not feel uneasy when they take the subway, and they will not even express their emotions clearly. My inner world is obviously wonderful, but I only have a score of 0.01. I know all of this, but I don't feel sorry for my uniqueness. I'm lucky because I've been cared for enough and everyone has taken good care of me, and I'm so grateful. I have always believed that everyone's existence is justified. So, I've been clumsily trying to live my life all the time, but I didn't know how to explain to Edward Lee, whom I had only met twice, that I had never been able to articulate my inner thoughts to others. So, I could only keep silent. It took me a long time with Edward Lee, and finally, he probably got bored and straightened up nonchalantly. Put your hands in your pockets and walk out. When he got to the door, he paused and said to me, Okay, I'll go get the bowl from you. He spoke in such a high tone, that I could clearly perceive that he was not bothered. While he was eating the noodles, he forced me to eat a little more. I was going to skip breakfast today. However, Edward Lee said, You look like a weak chicken, and if you don't eat breakfast, you're going to faint. My attention was so focused on him, that he was going to force me to eat breakfast, and I didn't realize that he was saying that I had fainted. Otherwise, I should have figured it out. After eating the noodles, Edward Lee didn't let me go. I'm going to be late. He grabbed the corner of my clothes with one hand and put a motorcycle helmet on my head. I have said it all. I won't eat your noodles in vain. What do you do in such a hurry? I'll send you. I can't hide from him. How dare I take his car? I just wanted to say no. Edward Lee looked at me fiercely. How dare you say no to Lao Tzu? I'm so wronged, but I can only hold back. I obviously only know him. How can he look like he's known me for a long time? So fierce. Sure enough, the school rumors were all true. He was just very fierce, and no one spoke to me so loudly. It was my first time riding a motorcycle, so I was so nervous. In order not to be next to him, I sat far away from him. At least a person and a half could sit in the middle. Edward Lee started the car, the corners of his mouth raised with a wicked smile. If you're afraid, you can pull me in. Jokes. Pull him. I don't. Before I could finish my sentence, he suddenly started the car, not because I was exaggerating, and almost threw me off. This is how he repaid me for a meal, which was clearly correcting me. During the whole process, I grabbed the back seat with both hands, and if it wasn't for the good quality of his car, I would definitely scratch the back seat for him. When I was about to get to school, I snapped, Stop. The voice was so loud that it scared me again. Edward Lee paused. He wore a helmet and spoke in a muffled voice. What's wrong? Under the weather? Want to throw up? As I got out of the car, I replied, No, I want to get off right here. Shu saw that my movements were too clumsy, and he reached out and pulled my clothes. Slow down. Don't fall. Edward Lee saw that I was standing firm before letting go. It's almost there. What are you doing here? You're too famous. It's not good to be seen. Edward Lee laughed angrily. Just say that Lao Tzu has a bad reputation. I'm afraid it will affect you. I hurriedly explained. No, that's not what I meant. Edward Lee scoffed. Coward. I would have said that. Edward Lee started the car. All right, let's go. It's almost there. Don't listen to those rumors. It's all nonsense. Lao Tzu hasn't done those things. I didn't see him going to school. Edward Lee, aren't you going to class? I didn't have an early class. I wondered even more. Then why are you getting up so early? Edward Lee turned his head uncomfortably, trying to stagger my eyes from him. Lao Tzu is idle. I thought to myself, what a weirdo. Edward Lee was so weird that after that day, he came to my house every day for breakfast. No matter how early I am, he always opens the door at the same time as me. He said he couldn't cook, and I had never seen anyone who rubbed rice so straightforwardly. I looked at Edward Lee, who was eating breakfast in front of me, with a tufty hair on the top of his head. I have a hard time connecting him to the rumored Edward Lee. I looked at him and couldn't get a word out of it. Edward Lee, you're very different from the rumors. At that time, he had just swallowed a meat bun. What's the difference? Aren't you very good at fighting? Don't listen to those nonsense rumors. They are all nonsense. And Lao Tzu will not fight. I glanced at the wound in the corner of his eye. He was uncomfortable explaining. Cat scratched. I was originally a person who didn't eat breakfast, and I was forced to eat breakfast by him every day. And I was about to grow meat. I knew the school bully, but I still couldn't hide it from my roommates. That day, I woke up with a cold in the morning, but I didn't take it seriously. But Edward Lee seemed to see that I was not looking good. While I was going to lunch at the cafeteria with my roommates, someone called me, Sheila Lam. I looked back with my roommates, and Edward Lee came up from a distance, and dropped my bag in front of my roommate. Next, I scrambled to catch it. It was a box of cold powder. Edward Lee looked uncomfortable. I bought it by the way. Remember to eat it. When he saw me stupidly looking at the cold medicine in my hand, he didn't reply to him. He snorted and pulled at my clothes. Come back to your senses. Remember to eat. Do you hear? I nodded dumbfounded. Got it. I don't know if it's my delusion, but the corners of his mouth are raised when he leaves. Is he happy because I promised to take the medicine? I looked back, and my roommates' eyes were full of excitement when they looked at me. Roommate 1, Sheila Lam. What's that? Roommate 2, I'm not mistaken. That person is Edward Lee. Is that the Edward Lee we heard about? Roommate 3, oh my god, that high nose, that knife-like jawline, and those eyes that look like dogs are affectionate. Edward Lee's face is really not blown. Sheila Lam, you're so good that you have fallen into such a big guy without making a sound. Roommate 4, Sheila Lam, I didn't expect you to shoot so quickly in just a few days. I told you to find a random floor that day, but fortunately you didn't listen to me. Otherwise you miss such a marriage, and I would be a big sinner. I pursed my lips. Why? The more they talked, the more mysterious. You're mistaken. We're not the relationship you think we're in. Edward Lee doesn't like me. I'm so boring. How can anyone like it? The roommates' faces, we all know the expressions. I was anxious. I can explain. Roommate, oh, explain something. Sheila Lam, you can't explain it clearly. Don't worry. We can make it up on our own. The excitement of my roommates lasted for a long time, and I was lying in my apartment bed at night, and they were still discussing. Although I have explained to them everything that has happened to me and Edward Lee in the past few days, they are still analyzing everything in the group. The heat has been going on for a day now. Roommate 1, look, comrades, what did I find on Tiba? 2 pictures were thrown out. I clicked on it and saw that it was a picture of Edward Lee smoking, which was supposed to be in a bar, as if someone had taken it secretly. He leaned against the wall and looked languid, with a cigarette in his mouth. He was lighting it, and the metal lighter glowed coldly in the dim. Another one was secretly taken at the same time. In the photo, he was holding a cigarette between his fingers, not knowing what he was talking to the person opposite, with a little coldness in his eyes. I clicked on it and looked at it for a long time, and I don't know why, but Edward Lee in the photo gave me a very different feeling. I think that's who he really is. It turns out that he smokes. But after so many days, he hasn't smoked in front of me once. So I don't even know he has this habit. The alert tone of the phone message brought me back to my senses. Roommate 2, I definitely like Sheila Lamb. I'll just say I can't believe it's Edward Lee today. You can see how different he looks to Sheila Lamb from what he usually looks like. The look of that little milk dog today almost didn't make me dare to recognize that this was our school's school bully. Edward Lee. Roommate 3, strongly agree. I haven't heard of Edward Lee having any patience with any girl. Roommate 4, Sheila Lamb. It looks like Edward Lee just likes you. They have a point. Me, stop talking. Let's go to sleep. Reminder, we still have 8 mornings tomorrow. Roommate 1, yes, it's annoying. The whole A college is the most early 8 in our major. Roommate 3, don't talk about it. Good night. Roommate 4, good night plus. Me, good night, good dreams. After putting away my phone, I had insomnia for the first time, and my mind was full of questions about whether Edward Lee had patience or not. Is he impatient? He's so patient, and I think Edward Lee is the most patient when he asks me to eat more every morning, and he will talk to me a lot. I don't know when I fell asleep, and when I woke up the next day, I felt that I was in a bad state, that I shouldn't have been. I can focus on very few things, and I will struggle with one thing for a long time, but my brain capacity is very low, so I don't want to have these troublesome things that I don't understand. Overcoming the outside world has already consumed most of my energy, and I can't take my mind off it. So, when Edward Lee was about to drop me off today, I refused to get in the car with my shoulder bag. He rubbed his brows. He hadn't woken up yet, and his voice was hoarse. What's wrong? But the tone is particularly gentle. I can't say anything when it comes to my lips. I kept thinking about the words, and Edward Lee didn't rush and just waited patiently. I held it for a long time, and finally I said, I want to walk to school. He didn't hesitate at all. Okay, I'll accompany you. As soon as Edward Lee took off his helmet, he was about to untie the helmet on my head, and I subconsciously dodged it and solved it myself. I want to walk to school by myself. I don't want to bother you. Edward Lee's hand paused, and he just looked at me quietly. Sheila Lamb, do you think Lao Tzu is embarrassing you? At that moment, my heart was sullen. Standing in front of me was Edward Lee. How could he have such thoughts? Not at all like the character he should have. No, I didn't think so. I looked up at him seriously. He also looked down at me. Give Lao Tzu a reason. I slowly lowered my head, and didn't dare to look at him, and whispered, it's my own problem. I just want to go alone. At that moment, I was actually very annoyed that my language organization skills were so poor. If I could be like ordinary people, then I would definitely be able to express myself clearly, so as not to be so unreasonable. Perhaps my tone was too stubborn, and Edward Lee's eyes darkened. Okay, remember to watch the road on your own road. Don't get distracted. Don't fall. There was a helplessness in his tone that was difficult to detect. I looked at him and said carefully, then I'm leaving. Well, call me for something. Good. From that day on, I avoided him for days. Edward Lee blocked me several times, but he couldn't get me. Finally, one day, very early, as soon as I opened the door, I saw Edward Lee squatting in my doorway and smoking, still holding the motorcycle helmet he had given me. Scared me so much that my voice trembled. Edward Lee, why are you here? Edward Lee lifted his eyelids and looked at me, flicked the cigarette ash, and extinguished it with his foot. I've been waiting for you, all night. No wonder. His voice is so hoarse. One night, Edward Lee snorted. How else do you think I can squat you? As he spoke, he slowly approached me, and I stepped back step by step. He glanced behind me and grabbed the hem of my clothes. Don't retreat. Watch out for the wall behind you. Then, Edward Lee bent down to eye level with me, and gritted his teeth. Sheila Lamb, she's really promising. She's been hiding from Lao Tzu for so many days. Which fool said bad things about Lao Tzu in front of you? And I need you to avoid me like this. He was so close to me that I had indescribable emotions in my heart, which made me panic all at once. So, I said something particularly hurtful. Edward Lee, I don't know you that well. I don't want to bother you. Edward Lee laughed angrily and wanted to reach out to touch me, but remembering that I didn't like other people's touch, he hurriedly withdrew the hand that reached out to me. Did Lao Tzu say a word of trouble in front of you? Don't be self-righteous yourself. You're doing this to me. In fact, the moment I said that sentence, I regretted it, and I wanted to explain. But the more I tried to explain, the more anxious I became. I've always been like this, disappointing the kindness of the people around me, and I still don't understand why Edward Lee had such a sudden kindness to me from the beginning. I subconsciously bit my lip, almost biting. Edward Lee glanced over my mouth and rubbed his hair irritably. Edward Lee reached out and reloaded my slippery shoulder bag. Okay, you don't have to get up so early in the future. Sleep more. Don't be sleepy on the road. Lao Tzu won't send you. You think I'm really idle. Lao Tzu is not rare for anyone to send. Just when I was making a mistake a few days ago. Edward Lee's voice was low and a little self-deprecating, and for the first time his eyes struck me as unfamiliar. But he was obviously so angry, and when he left, he still remembered bending down to pick up the cigarette butts on the ground one by one. From that day on, my life seemed to be at peace. Edward Lee and I barely see each other anymore, and even if it's a neighborhood, we rarely cross paths again. Until one day, a very ordinary afternoon, as soon as I got into the elevator, a couple of boys in jerseys entered the elevator with laughter. I was so small that I was squeezed into the corner. I saw Edward Lee at a glance. He gave me a casual look, then kicked one of the boys. Let's stand up for Lao Tzu. Don't you see anyone behind? A few older boys hurriedly stood up to make room for me. Only then did I find out that a few of them turned out to be the red-haired ones that day. They all dyed their hair black, and I barely recognized them. So, Edward Lee said that they had always been serious about getting them to change. Edward Lee was holding the basketball and leaning against the elevator, and his hair was wet at the tip of the ball. I just went to the supermarket and I had a bottle of soda in my bag. It was chilled. I was weak and rarely drank it, and I bought it today to reward myself. But, the hell is missing. I took it out, opened it, and handed it to Edward Lee with both hands up. He glanced at me and raised an eyebrow. I whispered to him, "For you to drink. I just bought it. It's iced, and it will cool down a little bit. Actually, I'm trying to say, Edward Lee, I'm sorry." Edward Lee took one look and took it with a slightly arrogant look on his face. "I don't really want to drink it either." Sensible, he said it casually, but the corners of his mouth couldn't be suppressed. Edward Lee took a sip, and suddenly, he called out to me, "Coward." I replied uncertainly, "Heh." He pretended not to care and said to me, "Otherwise, don't hide from me." After saying that, he turned his head uncomfortably to look away, but the hand holding the ball was trembling slightly uncontrollably. I noticed, smiled at him, and said softly, "Okay." Edward Lee's eyes lit up and he asked tentatively, "I want to eat your noodles tomorrow morning." "Okay, I'll get up early tomorrow to make it for you." It's hard to believe that I reconciled so easily with Edward Lee, who is a man who doesn't hold grudges. It's like, if I bow my head, Edward Lee will bow my head with me. The red hair from before listened to the conversation between the two of us next to him, and let out a huh. Edward Lee was upset and kicked him. "What are you calling blindly?" I looked at Edward Lee in amazement. Edward Lee quickly turned around and explained to me, "No, he and I are just friends joking. Joking, not fighting. He's happy." The red hair said to me bitterly, "Little sister-in-law, you can be considered reconciled with him. You don't know. Edward Lee is in a bad mood during this time, and what kind of life our brothers are having." "Little sister-in-law, you are very important to Edward Lee, and we have never seen him feel so bad at any time. Otherwise, you won't quarrel with Edward Lee in the future. He'll be sad for a long time." Edward Lee kicked him again. "What nonsense. You have a mouth, don't you?" After saying that, he pulled the corner of my clothes and said to me, "Don't take what he says to heart. They are used to joking." However, I don't know if it's my delusion. Edward Lee is quite happy, as if he is in a happier mood because of the red hair. Redfor got off the elevator on the 13th floor, and as he was leaving, he extended an invitation to me. Ask me if I'd like to go to the bar with them tomorrow. When I heard the bar, my eyes actually brightened in an instant. I don't know why, but the first thing that came to my mind was the bar with Edward Lee's picture on the post bar. To be honest, I'm curious, but I'm afraid I won't be able to adapt to the environment. Edward Lee rejected him on my behalf. Can't go. It wasn't until it was just the two of us that he said to me, Bar, you want to go? Your eyes just lit up. I was stunned. I didn't expect him to notice. Sheila Lamb, has anyone taught you? You have to say it if you want it. Don't hold back. I shook my head. The corners of Edward Lee's mouth rose with a hint of evil. Then I'll teach you now. Do you want to go to the bar? I've never been to a bar. Curious. Okay, follow me tomorrow, and my brother will take you to see. My eyes lit up. Is it really possible? Edward Lee holds the ball in one hand and the other in his pocket. No, in principle, but to you, it's hard for me to say no, but I'm a little scared of a lot of people. It's okay, brother. When I went to the bar, I really saw the world. There was everything in it. Everyone was very enthusiastic, but it was a little noisy. Edward Lee greeted him as soon as he passed. Don't smoke for Lao Tzu today. Speak civilly. Play games in moderation. Don't scare the little girl. Then he took me to a corner and sat down, and ordered me a glass of fruit wine for me to hold and drink, for fear that I would get drunk. The alcohol has a very low alcohol content and is not easy to get drunk, but gradually, I felt that my face was getting hotter and hotter, and I was a little dizzy. Sitting on the couch, I started to stagger. Edward Lee was afraid that I would fall, so he hurriedly helped me with his hand, and found that I didn't seem to be resisting him as much as I had before. He was like discovering a new continent. Poked my face with his finger. Sheila Lamb, do you know who I am? I looked at him, raised my hand and touched his eyelashes, and smirked. I recognize. You're Edward Lee. You have very long eyelashes. Edward Lee couldn't help but chuckle. I felt like I couldn't sit still anymore, and I wanted to lean on. When Edward Lee wrapped his arms around my waist, I was so scared to move. He was so close to me, and he drank a lot of wine, much higher than me, and the smell of alcohol was stronger, but he was as sober as if he hadn't drunk. Suddenly, he took my hand and lifted my hand to let my index finger touch the pink band-aid on his brow. Is it pretty? You gave me a band-aid. I gave it to me, and he snatched it from me, and I still remember it, because I like that band-aid very much, and the pattern on it is beautiful. But even if I was drunk, I still remember that he was a famous school bully in our school, and I didn't blink my eyes when I heard about the fight. Of course I didn't dare to disobey him. I hiccuped and I said, okay, good looking. I think it's unusually good. Good looking. The corners of Edward Lee's mouth curled into a nice arc. Looking flappy and lazy. Sheila Lamb, you don't hate me touching you, do you? My head was getting heavier and heavier, and I didn't speak. Edward Lee chuckled, his voice low and slow. Sheila Lamb, the grace of a drop of water should be reciprocated by a spring. How do you say to repay the grace of saving lives? I wondered, when did Edward Lee save my life? Edward Lee, I can't remember. Laughed and scolded, little conscienceless. I really don't remember. By the time I woke up, it was already the next morning. When I woke up, I found that it wasn't in my room, and I panicked and jumped out of bed. Edward Lee walked into the room with a glass of hot milk and toast. Are you willing to wake up? I looked around in confusion. Edward Lee handed over the hot water, and I took it with both hands. This is my room. What are you afraid of? I can sell you. How did I sleep in your room? Sheila Lamb, you're so good. You got drunk like that yesterday with a glass of fruit wine. In the future, you will not drink any wine that anyone gives you, but in front of me. Do you hear? I also really realized how much I was drinking, and nodded obediently. Got it. Edward Lee was satisfied. Well, it's not in vain that Lao Tzu took care of you all night yesterday. My face was full of shock. One night, Edward Lee smirked. Did you know that you're drunk? And you talk a lot. If I don't listen, you'll have to pull my ears to speak. I can't see it. I usually talk so little, so I am saving for this. My face started to heat up. I was so embarrassed. I didn't know I was drunk like this. It wasn't an environment I was familiar with, so I started to distract myself, and huddle in a corner and concentrate on nibbling on the toast. Suddenly, Edward Lee leaned close to me. Don't be embarrassed. Let's get down to business. I found out yesterday that you don't hate me for touching you. You actually don't contradict me in your heart. So can you tell Lao Tzu? Why did you go out of your way to hide from me for so long? I couldn't tell him why. He looked at me all the time, as if he had time to spend on me. I pursed my lips and hesitated for a moment, then finally considered the language. Me. My roommates said, you're a little different to me. And they said, you're. Before I could finish stumbling, Edward Lee picked up the conversation. I just have a crush on you. I didn't expect Edward Lee to be so direct, so suddenly. I choked on the toast. Edward Lee immediately walked over and took the toast from my hand, and stuffed the milk into my hand. Don't rush. Slow down. As he spoke, he patted me on the back as he reached out to my chin. If you can't eat it, you throw up. I looked at him with a frown. How could I spit out what was in my mouth on his hand? I shook my head, and he laughed. Why? Lao Tzu doesn't dislike you. What can't you spit on? In the end, I didn't vomit, but tried to swallow it. No, you can't like me. Edward Lee laughed. Lao Tzu also saved your life. And that's how you did it to me. Saved me. When? I looked at him with a puzzled look on my face, clearly disbelieving. Edward Lee nodded, with a bit of Ruffianism. Okay, no conscience. When did you save me? I'm not even impressed. Yes, I didn't save you, and I don't know who gave it to me. As he spoke, Edward Lee pulled a bear pendant out of his pocket. My eyes widened. Wasn't that mine? I've been looking for it for a long time, and I haven't been able to find it since I fainted on the subway once in my sophomore year, and I thought it was accidentally lost when I fainted that day. This is my bear. Why is it with you? As he said I'm going to get it, Edward Lee hooked the corners of his mouth, and deliberately raised his hand so that I couldn't reach it. I looked at him with a wry look in my eyes. Edward Lee hurriedly waved his hand. Your little bear. I didn't steal it. I didn't rob it. You had to give it to me. What I gave you. Yes. What did you say at the time? This is your favorite bear. I saved you. I am a good person. You have to thank me. Tell me to take it. So you were the one who saved me that day. Edward Lee raised his chin at me. What do you say? No wonder. No wonder. Edward Lee was like he knew me at first. It turned out that he was the one who picked me up fainting on the subway in his sophomore year. At that time, there was a sudden influx of people on the subway, but I obviously calculated the time, and deliberately waited until there were not many people to take the subway. And I did this every Saturday. But that day, somehow, there were too many people, and I was squeezed into the middle, and that was the first time I didn't make it to the terminal. But I couldn't hold on halfway. I squeezed hard to the door. My chest was very tight, and I couldn't hold on any more before I reached the door. The moment I fell, I seemed to hear an exclamation from next to me, and then I fell into the arms of a boy. He was in a hurry and picked me up by the waist, and I was so dazed that I could only see the outline of his face. It should be a very clean-looking boy, but then, I woke up from the hospital and didn't see the boy, and I always wanted to say, thank you, to him. But why don't I remember giving away my bear pendant? Did I really say those words? I wasn't even impressed. I confirmed, is it really you? Edward Lee's tone was helpless. It's really me. After knowing that it was him, I directly bowed to Edward Lee 90 degrees on the spot. The voice was rarely loud. Thank you, Edward Lee. Edward Lee was taken aback. Scare Lao Tzu. What are you doing? Get up. Don't move too fast, so as not to get dizzy. However, I kept bending at 90 degrees, and no matter how much Edward Lee tried to persuade me, I didn't get up until I had bent enough for 5 minutes. I want to make it clear to Edward Lee how much I appreciate him. Seeing that I was finally willing to get up, Edward Lee pulled my clothes and motioned for me to sit down. Are you dizzy when you wake up? Silly or not, you gave me your beloved bear, and you said thank you. As soon as he mentioned the bear pendant, I couldn't help but think of what he said when he said I was unconscious. His face turned red all at once, but Edward Lee wouldn't let me go, and the smile in his eyes became more and more obvious. Shy. I ignored him. Edward Lee was still laughing. Don't be shy, it's cute. There are very few people as stupid and cute as you. Sheila Lamb, I'm serious. Let me not be chased after me. I'm serious too, and I won't let it. Edward Lee looked at me half squinting. Give me a reasonable reason. I explained. I'm boring. Lao Tzu is good for you. I sighed and looked straight at him. Edward Lee, I've been looking for someone, he's a boy. As soon as the words fell, Edward Lee was stunned for a long time and did not speak. After a long time, he asked me in a low voice, is it important? I nodded, it's important. Do you like him? I like it. Huh. Edward Lee's eyes darkened. Then he really doesn't know how to lift. I carefully said to him, so, Edward Lee, you don't. Before I could finish speaking, he interrupted me. A cheerful tone, Cheng, Lao Tzu will accompany you to find it. Don't be a burden. Since then, Edward Lee hasn't said yes to me. After saying that, I felt much more relaxed. It was as if we were back to when we first met. Edward Lee always took good care of me and always did his best in every little detail. I thought that this was the way my life should be, but one day, I gradually felt that something was wrong. Every night after 9 o'clock, I would go down for a walk, and for a walk, I would close my eyes, and feel the small changes around me. But in the last few days, I've always felt like someone was staring at me. I've always been sensitive to the outside world, and I thought I was just overthinking. But that day, that gaze was always on me, and the sound of footsteps kept lingering around me. It's impossible for me not to be afraid. So, I tried to pick up the speed, but the footsteps picked up as well. I panicked, it was already dark around me, and I walked more and more. I ran all the way over, and the man was still following me, and I ran faster and faster, and I was afraid to be anxious. Why did he target me? It was getting darker and darker. I was running more and more hesitantly, and at that moment, I thought to myself that I might be done like this. However, I ran around a corner, and a boy in a white tee was standing against the corner under a streetlight. It's Edward Lee. I didn't care about calling him Edward Lee. The man following me paused, and I quickly ran over and grabbed the hem of his clothes. Edward Lee didn't expect to meet me, with a cigarette in his mouth. I gasped for breath, my hand holding the hem of his shirt trembling with fear. But I didn't let go of him, and pulled the corners of his clothes tight. It was the first time I had approached him, and Edward Lee froze, subconsciously extinguishing the cigarette in his mouth, while trying to push me away uncomfortably. I just smoked, it smells, don't get it. I didn't speak, pulling his clothes tighter. Growing up, my personality has made it difficult for me to cry. I have always been a very quiet child. Even if I feel uncomfortable in my heart, I can't cry. Tonight, I was too scared to cry, and I didn't know how to express my fear. I could only hold on to a small corner of Edward Lee's clothes, and look at him uneasily. Edward Lee frowned at me, and asked in a soft voice, Sheila Lamb, what's wrong with you? I struggled to find my voice. Someone has been following me for days. Edward Lee lowered his cheeks, with anger in his eyes, and directly took my hand. Where? Lao Tzu will help you get rid of him. And all eyes were on Edward Lee holding my hand. His hand was slender and wrapped around mine in a strong gesture. I looked at our hands in a daze, and it was strange that I didn't feel annoyed at all. Sheila Lamb. Edward Lee's voice came from overhead and brought me back to my senses. Where? The man. I froze for a moment, then raised my hand to the corner. No one. I frowned, looked up at Edward Lee, and said, he's gone. Edward Lee looked down, and suddenly, raised his hand to smooth out my frowning brow. Sheila Lamb, don't frown, I'll take care of that person, don't be afraid. His voice was so soft, so gentle, not at all like his usual one. However, I stared at him, and it was difficult to express what I was thinking, and it was strange, it swept through my heart like a feather, and it itched so badly. The next day, Edward Lee was sure that the bad guy would come to squat me again, because it was almost yesterday, and he didn't squat until I was unwilling. So in order to prevent future trouble, Edward Lee told me to continue walking at that point in time. To be honest, I was scared when I walked down the same path as yesterday again. I looked up at Edward Lee. Actually, I'm a little scared. Edward Lee patted me on the shoulder. It's okay, you can go forward boldly, don't be afraid, I'm behind you. Edward Lee lifted his hand against my head, and spun me around, put his hat on my head with his back hand, and then slapped me on the back with one hand, pushing me forward. Sheila Lamb, move on. Edward Lee's hat and his temperature, I wore it, and I felt a little more relieved. The man, he really came. I heard his footsteps. I stopped where I was, and the man's footsteps drew closer and closer to me. I told myself, don't be afraid, Edward Lee is near me. Suddenly, the man's footsteps stopped. Edward Lee's voice came from behind, hey, we'll meet. The man tried to run to the side alley, but as soon as he took a step, several intersections were blocked. I scared our sister-in-law and wanted to run, but you think it's beautiful. You brute. Edward Lee said we don't need to talk about martial arts to you. Scared our sister-in-law and wanted to run, did we agree? We Edward Lee are reluctant to be murderous, have you made up your mind? The previous red-haired ones are also here. I was about to turn around, but I was stopped by Edward Lee. He said, Sheila Lamb, you just stand where you are, put your headphones on, and play the song you usually listen to on the subway, and turn it up a little louder, and then I'll tell you to turn around, and you'll turn around, understand? I tried not to shake my hands so much, listened to Edward Lee, put on my headphones, and I stood there obediently, with my back to them. Yes, I understand. It was the first time, and I couldn't control my choked voice. The time of a song, I have never felt so long. When Edward Lee took off my headphones, my body shook again. Don't be afraid, it's over. I turned to look at him, and carefully looked at his whole body. Are you hurt? Edward Lee tugged at the corners of his mouth heartlessly. No, that guy is a fart. Then the police came, and Edward Lee, and they and the bad guy were taken away. I was in a hurry. I was afraid that something would happen to Edward Lee, and I was anxious to explain to the police. Edward Lee grabbed my clothes, and took off the hat from my head, and buckled it on his head. What are you worried about? Lao Tzu is a bad guy, this time, just defending. That being said, I know he just wants me not to worry. At the police station, I explained everything to the police about the bad guy who followed me, and the bad guy was detained for a month, and Edward Lee and they were criticized and educated. When I left the police station, it was already late, and I passed by the nearby gymnasium, where the concert was just over, and all the fans poured out. They were very excited when they watched the concert, and their eyes were bright. But there were so many people that Edward Lee and I were immediately in the middle of the crowd. I thought if I wasn't so scared, maybe I'd find it romantic. No more, no less, just right moment to stop, as if heaven had already set it up. But as I looked at the dense crowd, cold sweat began to break out on my back. My breathing started to get rapid, and Edward Lee called me next to me so many times that I couldn't respond. In a panic, I was pulled into a warm embrace. Edward Lee hugged me tightly, and his nostrils were full of his smell, which smelled so good and very reassuring. It was so familiar that almost instantaneously, I knew for sure that I had met Edward Lee in high school. After the crowd passed, Edward Lee let go of me, and he didn't look me in the eye. I'm sorry, I had to hug. Before he could finish speaking, I took the initiative to hug his waist and bury my face in his chest. Edward Lee was stunned, didn't know where to put his hand, and called out to me in disbelief, Sheila Lamb. I looked up at him, and my eyes turned red. It's exactly the same. When Edward Lee saw that I was red-eyed in front of him for the first time, he immediately panicked, and cautiously asked me, what's wrong? Did you just get scared? Next time I won't take you down this path. I stared straight at him. On the second day of high school, on the National Day of High School, there were a lot of people in a square, and I was trapped in the middle of the crowd like today. At that time, I was so scared that I broke into a boy's arms. Obviously he was just a stranger, but he stood quietly and let me hold him. That boy, isn't that you? I choked up a little and continued, didn't we meet in high school? Edward Lee's eyebrows were gently illuminated by the light. You just remember. Do you remember? Nonsense. Lao Tzu has hugged a girl like you, in high school until now. You said I don't remember you. Edward Lee. Hey, I've been looking for you. Because of a bosom, I went from high school to college. It was the third person I'd ever hugged besides my mom and dad, and it was so warm. And right now, Edward Lee is standing in front of me, and I have a lot to say to him. What can I say to express the feelings in my heart clearly? I'm sorry, I can't express what I'm thinking. You. In a hurry, I took his hand and pressed my cheek to Edward Lee's palm. Can you feel it? My face is hot, but I'm not hot right now, that means I'm nervous, and so is my heart. Very, very warm. Can you feel it? Edward Lee. I looked at him nervously, and finally, I bowed my head in frustration. I'm sorry, I can't express what I'm thinking. Suddenly, Edward Lee's big hand was on top of my head. It's okay, Sheila Lamb, I understand. Edward Lee leaned over and looked at me, at the same level. Can I hold your hand now? I thought about it for a moment and replied to him, seriously, yes, but you have to wipe your hands first. Edward Lee couldn't hold back and chuckled, okay, it's all up to you. Extra, Edward Lee. I think I must be sick. Every Saturday afternoon, at the same time, I accompany an unknown girl to take the subway line 1 on time. Then he sat back with her. She comes every Saturday to take this subway, from the beginning to the end, then return to the starting point from the end point. At first I thought she was weird, but when I think about it, I'm even weirder than she is. She didn't even know me, I didn't even know her name, but I stayed with her for a whole year. How did it start in the first place? It was I who passed her by chance at school, and I thought she was all too familiar. When I reacted, I realized that I had followed her all the way. That was the first time I took that subway. The second time, I was sent by the devil to accompany her on the subway again. Every time she took the subway, it seemed like she was repeating the tasks she had to complete every Saturday. She is so well behaved. She is so quiet. On the subway, she won't sit on the subway, whether there is a vacant seat or not, forever huddled in a corner, with headphones in your ears, and standing in order, wait for the subway to arrive, then stop to the subway and return to the starting point. If that corner was occupied by someone's luggage, she would stand in front of it for a long time, find a corner that she felt safer, and then stand in a proper manner. I love to observe her, so I know she might be a little socially impaired. However, I could tell that she was trying to adapt to the world. A very strong girl. It was as if she was cut off from the world, with a little world of her own, and then she tried hard to let the light from the outside into her little world. I feel like I'm crazy, and I'm going to be happy with every improvement she makes, even if it's a small one. I can't help but be afraid of her every time she is accidentally bumped into by someone else. Like a worried old father, I watched her adapt to the environment little by little. But one day, she fainted in the crowd, and God knows that moment, my heart jumped to my throat, and I ran over to catch her. The moment I hugged her, I recognized her immediately. I met her in high school, and I had a fight with my family that day, and I was in a very upset mood. She crashed into my arms recklessly, a very small person, with a dull hair on her head, and she was so obedient. At that moment, the anger in my heart disappeared inexplicably, and I should have pushed her away, but the ghost made me feel bad, so I just stood there and let her hold me. I even wanted to touch her head. I didn't expect that I would remember her for so long. At that time I just thought that her were worrying, and her obedient appearance was particularly itchy. I was worried about her, when she fainted, but when the doctor told me she was going to wake up, I suddenly started nervous again. I'm not ready to meet her officially, and I'm not happy with the way I look today. So, I ran away, and as I went, I vilely took the bear pendant from her bag. I told myself that I needed at least a week to prepare, and that's when I took the bear and asked her, "Did you drop it?" A perfect opportunity to get acquainted. However, the next Saturday, when I was working on a full belly of drafts, I took the bear with me, but did not find her. She doesn't take the subway anymore, and I still took the bear every Saturday and she never came. And when I didn't know how many times I had failed on the subway, I knew I needed a chance for her to get to know me, a chance for me to get close to her in the open. So, the moment the elevator opened, I almost thought I was dreaming. With just one pair of eyes, I recognized her. I resisted the urge to see her. I really haven't seen her for a long time. She hesitated at the elevator door for a long time, and finally was murdered by someone next to me. I really wanted to kick the guy next to me to death. "What are you doing so fiercely? Can't you whisper?" But I was afraid of scaring her, so I didn't dare to act on my own. I haven't seen any big scenes, but I've made a mistake in front of her. She wrapped herself tightly, and her hand holding the bag trembled violently. Is she afraid of me? At that moment, I couldn't tell how I felt in my heart. That's right, we are a university, and my reputation is so bad. How can she not be afraid? But I was still thinking about how to talk to her, and before I could say anything, she was already afraid of me. For the first time, I was so annoyed that I had grown an ungentle face. How could she be afraid of me? I really want to tell her, don't be afraid of me. I'm the least likely person in the world to hurt you. But her hands were shaking so badly that I tried not to deliberately press down on the nearest floor. The moment I stepped out of the elevator, I still couldn't help but look at her, like a frightened kitten, and I wanted to touch her head. The red-haired fool said to her face, Edward Lee hasn't arrived yet. This idiot, can I not know that I haven't reached the floor? I didn't see what the little girl was scared of. Under the pressure of my eyes, he probably realized the seriousness of the problem. Follow me out immediately, Edward Lee. Why are you so kind today? I'm annoyed when I look at them now. One with red hair, one with green hair, and one with yellow hair. If it weren't for them, maybe she wouldn't be so afraid of me, and I'd have spoken to her. I was very upset. I'm going to dye my hair back tomorrow, the red fur complained loudly. Why? I gave him a blank look, scared little girl. The three of them couldn't believe it. Edward Lee, have you taken a fancy to the woman just now? I kicked them. What a woman? That's your future sister-in-law. As soon as I got out of the elevator, I immediately heard that there was a new tenant on the 15th floor, and I was immediately sure it was her. That night, I rented the apartment across the street from her. I didn't dare go back to my bedroom that night, for fear of missing a noise from the other side. So, that night, I fell asleep against the door. When there was a sound of the door opening on the other side, I woke up and was so anxious that I didn't even have time to look in the mirror before I opened the door. When I met her eyes, I almost said, hello, long time no see, but luckily I held back. She cooked noodles for me in the kitchen, and I looked at her with my chin propped up. She's really well behaved, and she answers whatever I ask. When she nervously explained to me what her ancestors did for the last 2 generations, her sincerity made my heart soften. I thought, I'm done. I'm probably going to have to plant this little girl in the future. I asked her, what's your name? She turned around and said, my name is Sheila Lamb. She continued to cook the noodles while I carefully repeated her name, over and over again in my mind. She probably didn't hate him. Her name is Sheila Lamb. It turned out that if he asked, the little girl would say, it turns out that the little girl that Edward Lee has been thinking about since high school is named Sheila Lamb. He's a coward. The end.